All right, I'm going to welcome everybody. This is Alan Tannenbaum. And the name of our firm now is Tannenbaum, Lemole, and Hill. So I promised last time that there might be a little bit of surprise, and this is the first time we're appearing as Tannenbaum, Lemole, and Hill. Hill is Cindy Hill, who is with us today. Prior to last month, John Lemole and I were a construction law firm serving community associations around the state. We noticed in giving these sessions and other educational sessions that we were asked a lot of general counsel questions constantly, which we had to defer. And we made the determination that rather than defer them, from now on, we will handle them. And Cindy Hill has joined our firm. She's an 18-year practitioner as a general counsel, highly regarded, in the Sarasota Manatee market. And she has joined us as a partner. She's a member of the Florida Bar Condominium and Plan Development Committee, which are the general counsels around the state who meet periodically to discuss all the issues that might affect general counsel. And this legislation that we're going to discuss today has been very much on that committee's mind. So what Cindy's going to do is she's going to insert comments based upon what all of the general counsel are grappling with this legislation as we go through the various topic areas. Chad McClenathan, who is a 35-year general counsel, condominium homeowner practitioner, has joined our firm as of counsel. So we now have two very experienced general counsel that are on our team. So we are a community association general counsel and construction firm going forward. So let's talk about the legislation. And John, if you go to the first slide, I personally paid a visit to the site of Champlain Towers this past Saturday and took this photograph. So this is there's a memorial being built on the site, but this is the current presentation out there. It's very eerie. It reminded me of going to the World Trade Center site after all the destruction there. It's now an empty site. This is actually what drove, obviously, the legislation that we're going to deal with today. It was a year ago, June 21st, that building came down and resulted in the legislature acting this past session, the special session, and creating the legislation. So terrible tragedy, terrible that lives are lost. It did instigate some changes, which we're going to discuss. Maybe we have saved, or maybe the legislature has saved some lives going forward. So I think that's the greatest memorial to the folks who lost their lives and the families who lost people is have things now changed to avoid this kind of tragedy for others? I would say, from my perspective, yes, as painful as it may be. Okay, let's get into the guts of it. And I'm going to go through the first section as quickly as possible because most of the questions we've seen have been on the reserve side. So, John, if you can go on to the next slide. Quickly on this set a new parameter supposedly for community association managers. It's pretty innocuous. It basically says if you're a community association manager and the board directs you to comply with this statute, you should do it. Big news. Like your licensing already required that, your contracts already required that. So the legislature felt that they had to tell you that if the board tells you to comply with the statute, you should do it. So didn't increase your liability. Yes, John.
You know, there's an interesting question that's come up a couple times about this, and it's the converse. And it's just, and the question is, if the manager tells the board that the board has to comply with certain with these provisions, and the board refuses to do it, where, what are the manager's obligations at that point?
Maybe to resign. That might be a good idea.
That's what I would recommend, actually, that if the board is not going to act as directed or as recommended by management on such a large issue. I mean, we don't give advice to management companies, but they might want to think about having something in their contract that lets them automatically resign in these events. But I do like that it's clear that the management must comply as directed by the board, meaning if they don't get direction, the argument can be made they didn't have any other obligation.
Right. All right, John, next. So this is the first inspection requirement, and these slides will all be available to you. So don't think that you have to write all of this down. Anybody who wants the slideshow, Michelle can provide it. So all kinds of definitional problems. The engineers don't know what these words mean. I certainly, as a construction lawyer, don't know what the words mean. But difficult words. Load-bearing walls, I think I know what that means. Primary structural members, not so much. So there's going to be a lot of debate about what that means. I think most engineers probably could figure that out. The licensed architects and engineers, now what the legislature did is they said, well, we're going to allow for both architects and engineers to perform the functions that are called for in the statute. I have a big question about whether architects can actually perform that function, whether they're licensed to. That's going to be a debate issue. But maybe more importantly, are they even insured to do structural inspection? And if you look at a liability insurance policy for an architect, it really restricts their coverage to architectural functions. And if they're doing something outside of an architectural function, there may not be coverage for that activity. So the legislature may have overstepped a bit. And some of the associations may be calling architects out to do these inspections and find that the smart architects are going to tell them, sorry, no, it's outside of our licensure and outside of our insurability. Again, there's a definition about determining the general structural condition of the building. I don't know what the general structural condition of the building means as it affects the safety. Go ahead, John, to the next one.
One thing to note before we go on to that, Alan. So these provisions regarding milestone inspections, as opposed to the other inspections that we'll talk about later, they're not in the Condo Act. They're in Chapter 553. And so I think, and I've gotten a lot of questions from folks that are saying, well, where does it say this in the Condo Act? It doesn't say it in the Condo Act. So if you're looking for it, it's in Chapter 553. So just make a mental note of that.
Thank you, John. Again, and for anybody who's interested, this is the licensure requirements for architects and engineers. It basically says, engineers can't practice architecture and architects can't practice engineering. The only exception for architects is if it's incidental to their architectural practice. So in theory, if an architect's designing a home and there happens to be a load-bearing wall in the plans, the legislature gives them some leeway to do potentially that portion of the design. But it would be very tough to argue that being called out to do an inspection of a building in place is incidental to architectural services. So I have a big question about whether architects by licensure are even able to do what the legislature has apparently saying that they're now allowed to do. But again, I worry about the insurability issue. The carriers are not going to go along with this, or at least haven't yet. So you may find again a lot of architects are just going to refuse to do what the legislature has allowed them to do. Apparently, go ahead, John. All right, again, definitions. These are not terms that they necessarily teach in engineering school. And now you're having the engineers having to make these calls. Substantial structural distress that negatively affects a building's general structural condition and integrity. Again, if you go to an engineering textbook, you're not going to find that type of language. So now the engineers have to determine what these means. Now it says what it doesn't include. Doesn't include cracks, distortion, sagging, deflections, misalignment. Well, if a slab is distorted, sagging, and cracking, is an engineer going to say, well, I see all of that, but it doesn't mean that's structural distress? No, they're not going to say that. So I don't even know why they have that disclaimer. If there's a sagging slag, you're not going to find a structural engineer in the state of Florida is going to say, yeah, well, that's okay. You know, that one passes. No, that's not going to happen. And then it gets into the phase 1 and phase 2, which we're going to get on to next. Go ahead, John. All right, this is some of there's a really good slide at the end of the program so that you don't have to memorize all this, but this says when the inspections have to occur, this milestone inspection. It's a shorter time period for buildings, 30 years of age. If the building is located within 3 miles of a coastline, whatever a coastline is, that's not easily defined. You know, there are inlets. There may be a coastline that where there's a river going out to the coast. Where does the river end and the coastline start? A lot of questions about that. Where's that measurement to be taken from for any particular condominium? Legislature doesn't really help with that. But 25-year-old condos have a different deadline. Again, these are all summarized at the end of the program. The condominium association has to arrange for the inspection and ensure compliance with the requirements of the section. That's understandable, and the condominium is responsible for all costs. Now it says here, does not apply to single family, 2-family, or 3-family dwelling with 3 or more habitable stories above ground.
3 or fewer.
Yes. So everybody in condo world, lawyers, engineers, insurance people are all saying that a first floor parking with 2 residential floors above it is a 3-story building. So the legislature hasn't given us guidance on that, but everybody in the industry is calling that a 3-story building. So if you live if you're managing a condo on a barrier island and the first floor is not occupied, but the other 2 floors are, and it's a condominium, you better comply with the statute until the legislature says otherwise. And if you're in a homeowners association, it doesn't apply. And if you're a condo or a co-op that is 2 stories, it doesn't apply. But if you're a condo, 3 stories, this all applies. Go ahead, John.
And just also to reiterate a point that bears reiterating. So these milestone inspections have to be done every 10 years. And the starting point for these, unlike the other inspections we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is the completion of the building. And that would be tied to the certificate of occupancy. And there is a definition of coastline elsewhere in the Florida statutes. It's equally confusing. I don't know what the answer is. You're going to have to sit down with your general counsel and decide whether you fit within the 30 or the 25-year mark. But Cindy, you know, that there's a lot of, she'll probably tell you there's a lot of ambiguity in that, because the coastline definition is where the mean low water, the mean low tide mark on land meets the sea. So what is the sea? So that's open for a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, no, John, we could take the position that all of the condos on the Gulf Coast are exempt because they're on a Gulf and not a sea. So
yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it only applies to the East Coast or if it
right,
maybe it doesn't apply at all here.
well, and then nobody take that at face value, because we will not make that argument. Cindy, is there a reporting requirement to the state for 3-story buildings?
Yes, there is. In the middle of all of this more complex and expensive legislation that's coming down, it can be easy to forget that part of the legislation includes that condos that have buildings, now not just owner buildings, but any buildings of 3 stories more in height, have to report that information to the division before January 1st, 2023. And I had to look at my notes on that because I don't have the best memory for numbers. But that information includes the number of buildings that are 3 stories more in height. And again, buildings, not just residential. The total number of units in all buildings, whether or not there are units in it. The addresses and of course the counties in which it's located. And then the division in turn has an obligation to then put that information on its public website. So that's a compliance that if you need any guidance with, do get with your general counsel. But if you already know you have 4 or 5 buildings that are 5 or 6 stories, for instance, you need to be looking to report that to the division, because you would not want to end up non-compliance with such a really relatively easy thing to do.
And I'm sure the division is going to send out a mailer to all the condos in the state or email them.
I'm sure they'll do something. What they'll do, but yes, I'm sure they'll do something, because they're going to want this information coming in as fast as they can so they can turn around and get it processed. That's a lot of work to put on the division, and I didn't see any additional funding given to the division to do this.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, John. Next slide.
Let's just talk about a question really quickly, because it's apropos of this section here. And Joyce asks about the exception for single family, 2-family, or 3-family dwellings with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground. And I think what that's getting at is, you know, a villa style, let's say a villa style condominium that may be 3 stories, but only has up to 3. So like a connected a villa or a townhome kind of building under a condominium regime, where the maximum number of dwellings is 3. And if there's a 3-story building that has 3 or fewer dwellings in it, that is an exemption that was carved out. You know, so it's not the clearest thing in the world, but I think that's what that's getting at. And I hope that answers Joyce's question.
It's a terrible provision.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it is. It is very confusing.
All right, next slide, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're not going to dwell a lot about this. Again, this is a time period. This gets the building department involved. I don't know if they were communicated with. They are also very busy these days, but now they have some obligation. So it looks like they're going to have to determine whether inspection is required, and they have to provide written notice to the condo association. Condo association has 180 days to act. Again, how they know about it, I guess they'll have to go through their records and survey all the condos within their jurisdiction and figure out which ones meet the requirements of the statute, and themselves send out notice. So they're, again, putting an additional burden on building departments that wasn't funded. Now, really important is this last bullet point. This is a change in the law. All the cases that interpreted board of directors individual liability interpreted the statutory sections as saying that, you know, and I'll paraphrase it, basically, if you weren't stealing from your association or using your power for discriminatory purposes or vindictive purposes, or giving a benefit to your brother-in-law's company by buying services at greater than market value, there was no means of being personally responsible for bad business decisions and even neglect.
Mhm.
That was a line of cases that came down on individual liability, even to the extent of ignoring necessary building repairs. There
Mhm.
were cases on that.
Yes.
This changed it. This section, if they willfully and knowingly fail to have the inspection performed, it's a breach of that fiduciary duty, which opens up personal liability on the part of a director that didn't exist before. So this is a change from the common law. Now, that's bad news because there's liability. What's good news about it is, again, it's another talking point to give to the owners who are complaining about a special assessment and complying with the statute, and, you know, don't want to do that. Show them this statute and say, you know, fine, you take my seat on the board. You have this responsibility, because I now, the legislature is saying that I must do this, that I have personal liability, even though it's protected by insurance. We have no choice but to do this. And actually, I think that's going to be helpful for board members and managers in order to actually do the job the legislature is telling you to do it by having included this. So I want to look at it in a positive sense, that this is a talking point to say, look, we have no choice. You know, it's too bad that you have to pay the special assessment, but we got to do it. So bad news and good news at the same time. Go ahead, John. All right, this is a phase 1 inspection. And it's a required inspection. Again, if you are 3 stories or more in height and don't meet that exception for single family or 2-family dwellings, for a condo or co-op, first they got to do a visual inspection. Now, the problem with it, there's a couple of problems with it. One problem with it is what can you tell from a visual inspection? Sometimes not a lot. And then they got to make a determination of no substantial structural deterioration, and there doesn't have to be the phase 2. Well, what engineer in his right mind is going to pass a building and say it doesn't have to have a phase 2? Maybe some of them will under certain circumstances, but think of the liability if they don't call for a phase 2 and that building comes down or a portion collapses a year after. So their insurance companies, and they're going to say, you know, really say a building passes okay on a visual inspection without doing the phase 2, and see if we insure you next year. So I think a lot of engineers are going to say, the heck with it. I'm going to say the phase 2 is necessary. And I'm not saying they don't need more business, but it also, you know, to be cynical, the choice will get them another inspection of much greater value. So that's a kind of a strange thing that they put in there. Go ahead, John. I'm going to get through the rest of it as quickly as possible. All right, phase 2, engineer comes back and says, I see some signs of trouble. I need to dig into this building. it gives the engineer the full discretion as to what needs to be done. Look at the second sentence of the second paragraph. As extensive or as limited as necessary to fully assess areas of structural distress in order to confirm that the building is structurally sound and safe, so on and so forth. And the program for assessing it, boy, that gives an engineer a lot of power. It looks like they make the call. So the board can't say, look, we don't want you to go that far. And the engineer says, sorry, statute says I gotta go as far as I need to go. And it's my discretion. Very interesting transfer of power to a professional that the association is hiring, you know, but that's what they did. And it's gonna create some very interesting scenarios when an engineer says, we're gonna have to rip apart this whole building in order for me to reach that phase 2 determination. And I'm sorry, folks, it's gonna cost you $150,000 for my examination. So troublesome. Go ahead, John. All right, then there's this report. And it says what it's got to have in it, pretty heavy conclusions. But look at 9. It has to be distributed to each condo owner. And it says how, and it has to be made available and put on your website. So forget hiding anything about your building. Once this phase 2 comes out, it's open for public view. And again, that's controversial, but it's going to have to go up there. You don't control what the findings are. Whatever it says, you're stuck with them. Gets published. You have no choice. That's going to cause some interesting issues. Go ahead, John. All right. Again, this is the building department and now the county's involved. So the legislature, I don't know if they called the building officials and the county officials and say, we're about to put some burdens on you. But the building department can give penalties and timelines. What's really strange is that they move to what the Board of County Commissioners does, which doesn't make a lot of sense because you can have 4 municipalities with their own building department functions within your county. And now the county has got some responsibility over what the building departments are doing, which is a mess even of itself, and gives the county, for some reason, now jurisdiction over what may be a localized building official's responsibility. A lot of confusion there. Go ahead, John.
Cindy, have they talked about, because there's the big takeaway in this section is that if there are repairs recommended after your phase 2 milestone inspection, you have a certain amount of time, 365 days, to start to make those repairs. If any of you have performed a major repair project recently, I'm sure you've run into problems with delays because of the lack of materials, price escalations, things like that. Is there any kind of safety valve here if you can't commence your project within 365 days because there are labor shortages or supply shortages? Has that been discussed in your committee?
No, well, it has, because there are no protections in what's written here. The committee is putting together what they call a list of glitches, which are not necessarily the more substantive issues that come up in these conversations, but they are the, hey, wait a minute, common sense, let's put something in here. And this is one of the glitches. What happens if there's a supply chain problem? What happens if there's a labor shortage? There's no cushion here for reasonable efforts from a board not being able to meet this requirements. That's definitely something the committee has put together and going back to the legislature with their list for the next session to fix, without, again, trying to argue about some of the substantive provisions, but more just the, guys, you got to give us some guidance here.
Good. Well, hopefully they listen.
They don't traditionally do so, but the committee's trying. And again, we're trying with these soft serve requests, so to speak.
Yeah.
John, you're on.
Oh, okay, good. All right, so now we're going to get into the condo statute portion of this, and this is where a lot of, I think there's a lot more ambiguity here, and I think that's because, as Alan said at the beginning, and we've heard as well from other folks, the legislature was really focused during its special session on the safety issues and making sure that buildings were inspected. And that the state had and local officials had a good census of buildings, their ages, and what problems may be on the horizon with some of these older buildings that may have been neglected. But of course, and so I think there's a lot more overall clarity in the milestone inspection provisions. There's definite timelines, and so that's a little less ambiguous. But then the second step that the legislature took, and this is really because how do you fund this stuff? The money has to be available, and for a lot of older communities, as you probably all know, there are problems with reserves. There are old buildings that are in need of repair and not enough money to repair them. And so the legislature crafted this second shoe, if you will, in the Condo Act, which relates to reserve studies and reserve funding. So we're going to talk about that now, and I think you'll see there's a far more ambiguity here. And these are all areas where it is highly recommended that you sit down with your general counsel and look at these issues, because there are going to need to be some interpretations made and some tough calls in some instances. So to jump into it, you have a whole second set of investigation for buildings that are 3 stories or higher. So the same buildings that fall under the milestone inspection also need to, every 10 years, perform something called a structural integrity reserve study. And there's a definition. It's defined at a new section 718-103-25, subsection 25. Now, what used to be in 25 wasn't taken away. It was just kind of shifted down. So that's where they've inserted this. But what is a structural integrity reserve study? We'll call it SIRS for short. That seems to be what everybody's gravitating towards as an abbreviation. It's a study of the reserve funds required for future major repairs and replacement of the common areas based on a visual inspection of the common areas. That sounds like a typical reserve study, right? That's what everybody's kind of familiar with doing. However, they've added an extra little layer to this, and a structural integrity reserve study can be performed by anybody who typically has performed them in the past. However, the visual inspection portion of the structural integrity reserve study must be performed by an engineer or an architect, licensed Florida engineer or licensed Florida architect. So they've added this layer to the reserve study process, where you actually have to have a licensed engineer or architect who's looking at the building and evaluating the integrity and the estimated remaining useful life of a number of different components, and we're going to look at those in a second. But let's talk, before we get to that, let's talk about what that engineer or architect has to do. It must identify, the study must identify the common areas being visually inspected, state the estimated remaining useful life, an estimated replacement cost or deferred maintenance expense of the area being visually inspected, provide a recommended annual reserve amount that achieves the estimated replacement cost or deferred maintenance expense of each common area being visually inspected. And so, it's a very detailed reserve study that is being done. But here's where the rubber really meets the road. The old statute had a couple of areas that needed to be that reserves needed to be calculated and assessed for. Buildings 3 stories or higher are now going to have to broaden the list a little bit of the things that must be visually observed and inspected by an engineer or architect, and then reserved for. And that list, you'll see it here, includes roof, load-bearing walls, or other primary structural members. I don't know exactly what that means, but I guess the engineers will determine what a primary structural member is for the building. Floors, foundation, fireproofing, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting. And here's the one that everybody gets up in arms about: windows. And let's put a pin in windows for a second. We'll come back to that. And then the catch-all: any other item that has a deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that would exceed $10,000, and the failure to replace or maintain such item negatively affects the items listed in subparagraphs A through I, as determined by the licensed engineer or architect performing the visual inspection portion. Okay, so as Alan said earlier, this legislation gives the architects and engineers very broad discretion in how they do these inspections, what they recommend, and the same is true here, because it's the architect or the engineer who is determining what things need to be inspected in that catch-all section and whether or not they need to be reserved for. So let's talk about windows. Yeah, Alan.
Well, one important point is that what's in J here, the $10,000 amount, it was always in the statute. So the statute said had 3 discrete areas: roofing, painting, and pavement resurfacing had to be reserved for, and anything in addition that had a $10,000 or more deferred maintenance or expense or replacement cost. Now that always included the condominium structure. The problem is that very few reserve studies ever had a figure in for that because it was so difficult to determine. If you have a high-rise building, what number do you put in for balconies that may be deteriorating over time? The total replacement cost of replacing all the balconies? Very few condos ever included that as a reserve item. The key now is that it's specifically required. But again, how does an engineer determine that number? What is it? Is it, again, the full replacement cost? Is it repairs? Some very tricky determination by engineers to try to now meet the requirements of specifically reserving for things like foundation. What does that mean? How do you reserve for a foundation that you can't see? And you don't know really the condition of it unless you do some very substantial destructive work under the building. So very tough engineering challenges by already very overburdened engineers in the state of Florida. Go ahead, John, sorry.
So the questions that I've seen about this this structural integrity reserve study and what has to be inspected and reserved for, there are 2 things that keep coming up. There's the issue of windows, and because in most condominiums, the windows are the part of the unit, and so that's not a common area that the association has to maintain. So how do they inspect windows, and why should they inspect windows when they're not, when the condo association is not the one that needs to reserve for replacement of windows? And the second thing that I've heard frequently is, like, in the old statute before this, you had things like pavement was specified, right? So that's not in this list. So does this take priority and preempt what was in the old statute for buildings 3 stories or higher, or not? So I'm going to throw that to you, Cindy, and ask if there's been any discussion about the windows issue, and do you still have to also reserve for the things that that you used to have to reserve for, but that are not necessarily in this list.
I'll start with that. This is a different list. The list that exists currently before these laws were changed is still reserves that have to be scheduled and continue to do business as you've been doing with that. This is now a different box, so to speak. And there may be some overlap, and that's going to require some conversation with professionals. But it's not a replacement list. I want to be clear about that. Windows and then plumbing and electrical are both part of the committee's glitch request, because windows are, and also other glass enclosures on units, for instance, if a balcony is glass enclosed or something, may not be at all the association's responsibility. So we're seeking clarification on that issue, that to the extent the windows are not the association's responsibility, why should they have to have them be part of reserve study? And then the other concern the committee has of the plumbing and electrical systems, even though, John, you've probably not got questions about that yet. Our concern is, how do you say for the wholesale replacement of plumbing or electrical systems when that's a rare event? Usually plumbing is fixed ad hoc as needed, and electrical too. So the committee is seeking clarification on that. And hopefully the windows will be one that we get some clarification on. In the meantime, I would take the position generally that if windows are not the association's responsibility, there's no way they can be trying to put together reserves for them. It'd be inconsistent with the Condominium Act and their documents.
Again, that's a conversation you all should have with your individual general counsel, and let them make the call and the recommendation on that for you. But obviously you can see that's a very confusing area right now. Now, real quickly, let's talk about the timing of the structural integrity reserve study. So unlike the milestone, which is tied to the completion of the buildings, which we understand now to mean issuance of a certificate of occupancy, the structural integrity reserve study is timed towards the creation of the condominium. And so that would indicate that when the condominium is created is generally with the recording of the declaration. And so these inspections may be on different paths and timelines. They may not line up, although you would like them to line up because it would be certainly more efficient and less expensive. Unfortunately, that may not be the case. And the other thing to keep in mind for the structural integrity reserve study is that it only applies to buildings that are 3 stories or higher. So if you have multiple buildings in your condominium, it doesn't, and some are lower than 3 stories, you don't necessarily need to include that reserve study for those buildings. It applies, it's almost on a building by building basis. Now, I don't know whether it has to be a separate reserve for each of those buildings or whether you can lump all that together. I think that's probably another open area.
That's definitely another ambiguity.
Now, while making these studies, while requiring these studies and setting out the timing of the studies and what must be included in the studies, the legislature also made some provisions regarding assessment and collection of reserves. And so a couple of things are key about this. First of all, after July 1st of this year, before a developer turns over control of an association. So if you've got a turnover that's happening after, that happened after July 1st of 2022 or is on the horizon here, the developer must now provide and complete and do that structural integrity reserve study. And so if you're going through turnover, in addition to all the other things that the developer is statutorily required to provide to you, you should be looking for this study because it now is required to be done. If you had an association which existed before July 1, and was under unit owner control at that point, had turned over, was created, turned over before July 1st of 2022, you have until December 31st of 2024 to complete your first structural integrity reserve study. Okay, so there's there's no completing, there's no avoiding this, like with the milestone inspection. You say, well, my building's not 30 years old yet, or, our buildings were only completed 5 years ago, and, we turned over 2 years ago. So do we need to do this? And the answer to that is yes, you have to do this, and you have to do it by December 31st of 2024. Now, hand in hand with this, in addition with the obligation on a developer to do the study before turnover, there's also now a requirement that the developer cannot vote to waive the reserves or the funding of the reserves that are required under that subsection G, all of that list of items which must be included in the structural integrity reserve study. So the developer cannot waive or reduce reserve funding for those items. So that opens up another opportunity for an association that has recently turned over or will recently be turned over to take a look at the financials closely and make sure that you have full funding of reserves. Now effective December 31st of 2024. So they've given you those folks that have turned over and are under unit owner control. They've given you a little runway here, not much of a runway, but they've given you a little runway. Once you get that reserve study done, after that, you've got to reserve fully. You cannot waive or reduce or use those reserves for purposes and the interest on them for purposes other than their intended purpose. Now, this has created a lot of questions. There's a lot of ambiguity here, and Cindy can probably comment on that. And the question that most comes up is whether you can do pooled reserve funding, whether you have to do, individual full reserve funding for each of those components. Cindy, has that stuff come up in your
absolutely. This is completely unclear in terms of it doesn't. And this leads to actually what you were bringing up earlier, that a lot of folks are confused about whether this is replacing reserves or whether the statutory traditional reserves are staying. There was no real attempt for the legislature to try to recognize the overlap there. So we have total lack of guidance as to pooled reserves, whether you can pool them under the CSRS requirements now, whether it's okay to continue pooling as you have been under traditional reserves. The only potential good news I can say about that is the committee's reached out to the Division of Condominiums, which does have rulemaking authority regarding reserves. And the hope is that rather than wait for the legislature to act on this rather complex condominium-driven issue, the division will step in and create a rule that will provide the guidance everybody's looking for.
Cindy, let me ask you this question. The recommendation. So this particular budget year, there could still be a waiver of reserves, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Knowing that you're going to have a mandatory requirement coming down the road, did the committee discuss what's the best practice for groups that have always waived reserves? Would it be a good idea this particular season to, number one, not waive reserves, or recommend to the owners that if they're reduced, that they not be reduced to nothing? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an opportunity to bring to the owner's attention what the waiving of reserves does for the long term. The piper is calling. So if you continue to fully not fund reserves the next year, you're just setting up a bigger bill for the following year. So I would not recommend that as a practice. Now, granted, every community has a different dynamic. I'm not giving specific advice. But the other concern you're going to have is this is now on all the radars of the real estate market, is whether, buying a unit into a condominium, has it been funding reserves? Is it in good shape? Am I making a sound investment? Is the mortgage holder even going to give me a mortgage on this? So the sooner that a condominium can get itself in compliance with what's coming and anticipate the fees that are coming, the better. But that being said, I know some communities have had unexpected large bills over the last few years, unfortunately, that have already hurt them. There's a lot of complexities to that, but the best industry standard would be get yourself lined up for the fact the bills are going up.
Okay, good advice. Now we have a section in here on roof. There was some roof insurance and roof replacement issues. I'm gonna skip that today because most of it doesn't apply to condominiums. I'll just say real quickly that there's a change to the old 25% rule. So where you have a storm and if more than 25% of your roof needs to be replaced, the old building code required a full replacement of the roof up to the existing code standards that are in effect right now. That's changed. If your roof was constructed under the 2007 code or later, and you have 40% of your roof that's damaged in a storm, you now can replace the 40%. You don't have to bring the whole roof up to the new code standards, and you don't have to replace the whole roof. That's under challenge right now. The roofing industry has brought a challenge on that, so we'll see whether that's going to stay or not. At the end of our presentation, and if anybody wants this, you can email Michelle Colburn, and she will send this to you. But we put together a little timeline here for the major highlights and decision points and deliverables that need to take place under this new regime. Folks, here's some practical advice. Okay, Alan and I deal with engineers all the time. We talk to them. We review their consulting agreements for homeowners and condo associations. There are some engineers that are not jumping into this pool right now because they're uncertain as to what their obligations are. There are some engineers who have taken this on and they're ready to run with this. But as a lot of you probably have experienced, if you tried to engage an engineer recently, they are stretched really thin. So the practical takeaway here is, number one, if you've got to do these inspections, especially milestone inspections, don't wait, because you're going to have a hard time finding engineers who A, will do it, and B, can deliver it on time. So don't wait till it's like, on the eve of when this thing is due. Secondly, you got to be prepared. This is a big additional professional liability burden on engineers. Their prices are going to go up, mostly because their insurance premiums are going to go up. And they're going to be looking for ways to insulate themselves from that liability in their consulting agreements. So when you're presented with a consulting agreement for these studies, I would urge all of you, take a good look at them, talk to your general counsel about them, talk to a construction lawyer about them, and have those contracts reviewed, because what we're seeing is that in these engineering consulting agreements, there are all kinds of interesting provisions that engineers are putting in there to limit their liability. And that's never good for an association. The goal of every association is to transfer as much risk away from itself as possible. So, call us, call your general counsel, and take a good look at those things. So that's it for our presentation.
John, I have a point on that. John, I have a point on that. So, what engineers are starting to stick in are indemnity clauses to say, if we do these inspections and we get sued, even if we're negligent, the association has got to indemnify us against that liability, including attorney's fees and so forth. We recommend that you go to your own liability carriers and say, is there insurance or a rider that we can purchase that will cover that indemnity of the engineer? Because if you don't have it, you're now exposing the unit owners to substantial liability for the negligence of the engineer in performing the inspections. So the insurance industry is going to need to adjust to the risk. And it's fine for the association to have the risk of these inspections if the association in turn is insured for that risk. Otherwise, the enormity of the exposure that the association, by assessment uncovered by insurance may be absorbing could be very substantial. So time to have a discussion with your agent. If you see an indemnity clause and you have no way around it, because every engineer has it, that you make sure that you can purchase insurance to cover that indemnity exposure. So I can't emphasize that enough. So with that, we're now going to get into your questions. So if anybody wants to hang on, the official session is over for you managers. You've now cleared your CEU requirement by having attended the full session. But if you want to hang on while we go through some of these questions, then stay on with us. All right, I'm past the howdy doody questions. I think we've hit the 3 stories or more. John, you want to look at?
Yeah,
let me see.
Jenny asked, you know, there's some, she's concerned about the language about 3 stories high and 3 miles from the coastline. Look, every building 3 stories or higher has to be studied. The only difference about whether you're within 3 miles of the coastline is whether you need to do that on a 30-year schedule or a 25-year schedule. So it's not, it's a both. In other words, it's not, you know, you start with 3 stories or higher and then look to see where you are related to the coastline to determine when you have to do those milestone inspections.
All right, let's see. There's a question. The PE we use said he will not do the inspection until the regulation is better defined. He also says that many engineers are taking this. That's a problem. Again, the legislature didn't go to the Board of Engineers or the Engineering Society and say, we're about to impose this major burden on you in language you probably never heard before. What do you think about it? There wasn't that type of discussion. That's one of the reasons I mentioned the indemnity clause, because when all else fails and the engineer is taking on an assignment that they have absolutely no idea how much exposure they're absorbing, the simple answer for them is, we'll just have the association indemnify you against any liability that may arise from this, and go ahead and do it. And that's why somebody's got to insure this risk if it does get transferred. But again, the legislature set these mandatory deadlines, and what if an engineer won't do it? And what if the architect say we won't do it because we're not insured for it, and we could probably get we may get our license taken away, and then what do you do? And we've also heard associations say, well, we think we'll wait until the legislator clarifies before we even try to get an engineer out to do any of these things. We don't think that's a good idea. At least have your record that you tried to find an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And then if somebody tries to sanction you, that's probably a pretty good defense. There's a defense for you lawyers out there that's called impossibility of performance. It usually applies to contractual requirements, but it's probably a decent defense to some governmental entity trying to sanction you, that your response is, we've tried and we can't comply with what you're requiring. So we can't do the impossible. Let's see.
We got a lot of questions today.
Yeah, John, if you want to pick one out, go ahead.
I'm trying to get back to where we were. 2-story building where second story has a loft. I think that's, I don't believe the consensus that is that a loft is another story.
That is one of the
Yes.
questions that's on the glitch list for the committee, by the way. The loft was considered, not just beneath parking.
All right, there's a question. These items are for the structural integrity reserve study. Pavement is under the $10,000 reserve requirement. I guess, no, pavement is not structural. Okay. All right, Cindy, clarify this again. I'm being told 1- and 2-story condominium buildings are required to have a reserve study and fully fund the reserves, correct? And is it correct that they're not required to have a reserve study, but they are required to fully fund or to provide a budget that has the fully funded reserves under the original statute?
I'm looking at the question now because I think there's some overlapping that's happening here. The SERS study applies to the buildings that are 3 stories. The 1 and 2 stories do not have a SERS requirement. So I'm not entirely following the question. I'm sorry.
Well, they don't have to have a reserve study because that's discretionary. What
Correct.
they have to do is present a budget that has fully funded reserves under the prior statute. If they're a 1 and 2 story building, they still have to present a budget that has fully funded reserves, meaning the prior statute. But there's no requirement necessarily, although it's a good practice, that they utilize a reserve study in order to come up with their numbers.
Correct. Yes, they don't have to utilize a reserve study. That is right. They can continue the manner in which they've been operating to determine their reserves.
Right, but they have to at least show in their budget fully funded reserves like they always did.
Yes,
Um,
I'm following now. Thank you.
Question, if the entire board resigns because the owners do not want to pay for compliance with these provisions, then who is liable under the statute? So this is what happens. If the entire board resigns, and it could be for any reason, there's a provision under both 718 and 720 for the appointment of a receiver. So an owner can go to the circuit court, say, nobody's on the board and nobody's running for the board, and the court can order a receiver to be appointed to take over the operation of the association. That receiver in turn should comply with the requirements of this act, and as a receiver, hire the engineers and get all of this done. Now, the next question would be, does that receiver then have individual liability if it doesn't get done? And that's not covered by the statute, but there is a provision for a condo association in Florida that loses its entire board, and the owners don't want to comply. Now, the other part of it is, and Cindy, you can indicate that the board passes a special assessment. It doesn't need the owner's approval for that. And if they go on strike and say, well, we're not paying it, then the association needs to hire its lawyers to lien and foreclose on all those units. And what you're going to find once you do that is that, these folks who were very brave to protest are now in with the prospect of facing the loss of their units by a lien foreclosure are now not going to be as brave, and they will comply. So there's going to be some cards that's going to be necessary on the part of board of directors to call the bluff of owners who say, well, we're not going to do it, or we're not going to pay for it, or and rather than resign, let them let them take you out of office by a recall. And if they don't do that, then raise the money, pass the assessment, and then you'll see a lot, in my experience, you'll see a lot fewer and now have the courage to continue their protest. So there's going to be a need for some courageous board members and managers to step up and take on owners who just want to bitch about what's going on.
Alan, interesting question. David Troy asks about conversions. So he says, building built in 1962, but was converted to a condo in 2015.
Be careful, because we represent this association. So just give a really good answer to this one.
Well,
No pressure.
Taking the conversion generically, it's an interesting question, because I think the milestone inspection is tied to the certificate of occupancy, so it doesn't necessarily. I don't think the conversion really affects that if the building is more than 30 years old and it's now a condominium. At least my interpretation, and Cindy, I don't know whether you agree with this. But my interpretation is that you still have to do the milestone inspection because your building is 30 years old. Now it gets interesting with the structural integrity reserve study because that's tied to the creation of the condominium, and typically in a conversion, there's a conversion engineering report
Yeah,
that would have preceded the conversion or had been in tandem with the conversion, and there are certain reserve requirements that are a little bit different, or warranties that are given if they're not funded, if reserves aren't funded. So I wonder whether the structural integrity reserve study needs to be done on a converted condo that's less, let's say is only 5 years old as a condo.
Well, I think the argument would be tied to the declaration of condominium being filed, which would not occur until the conversion.
mhm.
And that would set that time period.
That's the position I'd take as well.
Okay. All right, there's a question. Is a 12/31/23 deadline for condos that have met the, I don't know what CO means there, certificate of occupancy timeline, definitely in effect. We've been told from various sources that 12/31/24 will be the actual timeline for everyone. I don't know if either of you can interpret that question.
Well, there's the for buildings built before 1992, so i.e. buildings that are already 30 years old as of July 1st, they have to do their first milestone inspections by December 31st, 2024. 3-story or higher buildings. Okay, so that is going to apply for any building built before July 1st of 1992. Sorry. The reserve study, structural integrity reserve study for buildings that are 3 stories or higher, doesn't matter when they were built. If they were turned over prior to July 1st of this year, they're going to have that first structural integrity reserve study for each building that is 3 stories or higher by December 31st of 24. So you're not going to, that you cannot get out of, as I read the statute.
All right, there's a question. What about townhome-like structures classified as condos, 4 units per building? First floor is garage with additional living, but insurable area. Then 2 floors above that. However, no units are on top of each other. The floors are all for the same unit. You want to hear that one, John? I don't know.
Well, the exemption for the milestone reports is 1 or 2 or 3 family dwellings that are 3 stories or less. And if we're saying that a story includes ground floor parking, if you've got a 4-family townhome dwelling that's operated as a condominium,
A fourplex.
A fourplex that is 3 stories, 2 garage, ground floor garage, 2 habitable floors above that. I would think that falls within the milestone reporting, inspection and reporting statute. It's funny, they don't say anything about that same exception in the SERS section. So I don't, there's another open item. But if you read, taking the literal reading of the milestone inspection language, that would seem to me to mean that, yes, that is going to need to be inspected.
All right, there's a question from Dale. Our engineer advised us to wait on the inspection until after the legislature tweaks these new regulations. So this is why you don't rely on engineers for legal advice, and you don't rely on lawyers for engineering advice. I worked in the Florida Legislature back when I was in law school, and I was in the inner workings of the process. And the predictability of what a legislature might do in the next session or the session after is kind of like predicting whether the Mets are going to win the pennant. They have won it once or twice, but whether they're going to win it this year, nobody knows. And that would apply to even the Phillies. Anyway, so no, don't wait, because they may not do a glitch bill at all in the next 2 years. They may fix some glitches and not others. So the key for association is, if you have a statute to comply with, it's on the books, comply with it. If, again, the engineers refuse to act and you can't find anyone to fulfill it, at least you've made a record of an attempt to comply as best you can. So if then a governmental entity or an owner comes at you and says, you didn't do your job, you have a record that says you made the attempt with the best advice from lawyers who are competent in the field. We attempted to follow the statute as best we possibly could, and we just were unable to do so or meet a deadline and so forth. But if you don't try at all, you're actually maximizing your potential exposure. And again, imagine if the very unfortunate circumstances that there's some sort of building collapse in the next couple of years, and you're on one of the boards that decided to wait to see, based upon what some engineers said, and you waited to do anything because you wanted to see if the legislature would clear up the ambiguities. You're going to get sued individually, and the defense that the statute was confusing and some engineer told us to wait is not going to help you. So I don't recommend that. Whoever that engineer was, sue him for legal malpractice, because that was a bad answer. And then he'll say, well, I'm not a lawyer, so you had no right to rely on my legal advice anyway.
I see a question here. Is there mandatory full reserve funding for items not considered of a structural nature? And the answer to that is no. If it's these new structural components that are mandating full reserve, your other not structural components can still be treated in the way they've been treated traditionally. Now, there's overlap there, so I'm not giving specific advice, but just answering that question generally.
Okay, I think we talked about windows. There's a question, are sliders considered a window?
Well, that goes back to the issue I brought up that the committees discussed, is to what extent is something a window or something glass? This is very document driven. Windows are not a given in terms of, I can tell you what your documents are going to say about who's responsible for your windows and what is considered a window, what is considered an opening, what is considered a covering. These are all document driven issues, unfortunately.
All right, Jim, this will be the last one. Sorry to interrupt. This will be the last one. Wouldn't the windows and sliders be covered because they would cause damage to the building itself if water intrusion? So although not a funding requirement, would the association be required to force an owner to maintain? Well, I personally think that any set of condo documents in a mid-rise or high-rise building that leaves the maintenance and repair of the windows and sliders to the owners, in my view, should be amended to make that a common element, or if not a common element, at least a responsibility of the association, because having individual owners repair their own windows, getting potentially equipment to get up there, and then if somebody doesn't maintain their windows, it could cause damage to the building and the unit below. I was called in recently on a project where it was actually the president's unit. Their windows were leaking, causing damage below, and I figured out early on why the general counsel was bringing us in, because we could sit on the president and not worried, and not worried about losing the account. But that's exactly what we had to do. First of all, the president was sitting in on the board meeting, at which his obligation to repair his windows are being discussed. I said, not a good idea. Exclude him from the meeting. And the rest of the board needs to make the business decisions relative to how to handle that. And they listen to it, but it causes all kinds of complications. So if you happen to have documents where the sliders in the windows are maintainable by the owners, you better be brave enough to start enforcing the requirements of the documents and bringing injunction actions if you need to, in order to require that those repairs be done properly. Otherwise, you're going to have damage to the rest of the building. You have the owner underneath now probably suing the association for failing to require that owner act. A lot of confusion. So I don't think you should reserve for the windows, but I think you should take action against the owner whose windows are not being maintained to make sure that they fulfill their requirements. That's my long-winded answer to that very difficult question. But my preference is that you just amend your documents to make it an association responsibility, which would clear up a lot of issues funding-wise and otherwise. Well, it is 12:20. Thanks for everybody who has hung on. This whole video will go on our website within a matter of days, so you can review it. You can send it to your other board members or other managers. And anybody who wants the written materials, let Michelle know and she will send them to you. If you're a manager, make sure we have your licensure information so we can get your CEU credit, and we'll have another informative program next month. I look forward to announcing it. Thank you, everybody.